By the early months of 1943, the Eastern Front had entered a new and volatile phase. The catastrophic defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked a decisive rupture in Nazi Germany's Eastern campaign. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had not simply been halted but encircled and annihilated on a massive scale. This shattered the myth of German invincibility and emboldened the Red Army, which now seized the initiative across a broad front. Soviet operations in the southern sector aimed to capitalize on German disarray, threatening to push Axis forces west of the Dnieper and liberate key urban and industrial centers. Among these, the Ukrainian city of Kharkov stood as both a strategic objective and a symbolic prize. Kharkov, having already changed hands twice during the war, was one of the Soviet Union's most important cities in the region. Its capture would represent a significant propaganda victory for the Red Army, while its retention remained vital to the Germans for logistical and operational reasons. As Soviet forces poured southward after the Stalingrad victory, they aimed to trap and destroy the remnants of German Army Group Don and collapse the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front. Soviet High Command, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Nikolai Vatutin, envisioned a broad offensive, confident that exhausted German formations lacked the manpower, armor, and reserves to mount a serious defense. For the Germans, the situation in early February appeared increasingly desperate. Army Group B had been shattered. Army Group Don, newly formed under Field Marshal Erich von Mannstein, was hastily reconstituted from battered remnants. Mannstein faced immense pressure. Hitler's orders forbade strategic withdrawals, yet Soviet spearheads had already crossed the Donets River and threatened to encircle both German and Romanian units. The German front was thinly stretched, and entire corps were in retreat or had ceased to exist. The Red Army now occupied a salient that reached deep into Axis territory, but its advance had also created vulnerabilities: overextended supply lines, dispersed formations, and reliance on rapidly occupied infrastructure that could not support sustained mechanized thrusts. In this environment, Mannstein began to formulate a counterstroke. Drawing on lessons from past operational art, he recognized that the Soviet offensive had opened opportunities for an encirclement of its own. If German forces could absorb the Red Army's initial thrusts and hold their flanks, a powerful counterattack might be able to strike into the exposed Soviet rear. This would require precise coordination, speed, and the concentrated use of Germany's remaining mobile reserves, especially the elite SS Panzer divisions. These units, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Totenkopf, had been refitting after previous engagements, and were among the few formations still capable of executing fast-moving armored warfare. Politically, Hitler remained convinced that the war could still be won through determined offensives. He viewed Kharkov as a cornerstone of the Southern Front and issued strict orders for its defense and recapture. German propaganda emphasized the need for iron will and total commitment, while Soviet broadcasts trumpeted the liberation of Ukraine and the final collapse of the fascist invader. Both sides viewed the upcoming battle not merely as a military engagement, but as a test of national resolve. The Ukrainian civilian population found itself caught between shifting fronts once again. In villages and towns around Kharkov, stories of German reprisals and Soviet requisitioning were already familiar. Entire communities were displaced or conscripted into support roles. The city itself, with its damaged infrastructure and traumatized residents, braced for another wave of violence and destruction. Industrial assets were sabotaged or evacuated by the Soviets. German aerial reconnaissance documented widespread movement of rail equipment and material out of the region, indicating that the Red Army expected renewed fighting in the near term. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht senior command staff in the south engaged in intense strategic deliberations. Mannstein insisted on operational flexibility, arguing that a temporary withdrawal to more defensible lines would create the conditions necessary for a successful counterblow. This contrasted sharply with Hitler's habitual demand for static defense and symbolic resistance. Ultimately, Mannstein was able to secure limited freedom of action, allowing him to implement what would become known as the backhand blow, a calculated retreat followed by a powerful mechanized strike aimed at encircling the Soviet spearheads. The groundwork was now laid. Soviet forces surged forward, confident in their momentum. German forces withdrew deliberately, sometimes under fire but always with a broader goal in mind. The SS Panzer divisions, meanwhile, assembled quietly behind the front, waiting for the moment when the hammer would fall. The Battle of Kharkov, once a symbol of German conquest, now stood poised to become the site of a dramatic reversal, one that would test the tactical skill of commanders, the durability of soldiers, and the shifting fortunes of the Eastern Front. The Soviet winter offensive reached its height in early February 1943, when the Voronezh and southwestern fronts converged toward the cities of Belgorod and Kharkov. General Nikolai Vatutin's mobile groups spearheaded the thrust, employing fresh tank armies supported by mechanized corps to exploit the gaps left by the shattered German formations retreating from the Don Basin. Forward detachments of the 3rd Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rybalko captured key crossings over the northern Donets, while infantry from the 40th Army forced passage points along icy tributaries, widening the breach and driving southwest. Soviet reconnaissance summarized the German opposition as fragmented battle groups lacking armored reserve, a conclusion that encouraged bolder penetration orders from Stavka. Fuel trains and ammunition columns rumbled along newly repaired rails, determined to sustain momentum before spring thaws made Ukrainian roads impassable. Inside Kharkov, the German commandant organized a hasty evacuation of non-essential personnel on the 11th of February. Field hospitals transferred patients to Poltava, and supply depots destroyed records and prepared demolition charges for heavy stores that could not be moved in time. Yet German signals traffic revealed no unified plan to defend the city. Colonel General Hermann Hoth, commander of the newly renamed 4th Panzer Army, reported to Mannstein that his infantry divisions lay scattered over a 240-kilometer arc with minimal artillery and scarcely 50 operational tanks. At Hitler's insistence, however, Hoth still held Kharkov as a fortress, obliging depleted Landesschützen battalions and Luftwaffe field units to dig shallow trench networks in the snow around the industrial outskirts. Vatutin capitalized on this disarray. On the 12th of February, elements of the 6th Guards Cavalry Corps bypassed German strongpoints north of the city and cut the Kharkov-Poltava railway, isolating Hoth's garrison. 2 days later, assault groups from Major General Ivan Galanin's 21st Army stormed Tractor Factory Hill, overrunning anti-aircraft positions manned by Luftwaffe crews untrained for close combat. Soviet sappers cleared mines under the cover of direct fire from Su-122 self-propelled guns, breaching the inner defensive belt before dawn on the 16th of February. By midday, red banners hung over the Regional Party Committee building, and Soviet correspondents filed triumphant dispatches heralding the liberation of Kharkov for the second time. The fall of the city seemed to confirm German collapse, yet Vatutin's operational map now displayed a salient almost 200 kilometers deep, its flanks guarded by rifle divisions marching on foot through waist-high snow. Supply echelons lagged behind tank columns, and mobile formations halted repeatedly for refueling at captured dumps. Forward Soviet brigades encountered growing shortages of artillery shells and engineer stores as they pressed toward the Dnieper. Meanwhile, Mannstein executed the withdrawal he had secretly prepared. XL Panzer Corps pivoted southwest behind the Mias River line, denying Soviet cavalry the encirclement they sought. Farther north, Army Detachment Hollet disengaged by night, burning bridges and leaving rearguard machine gun nests to delay pursuit. While Soviet attention remained fixed on Kharkov, 3 elite SS Panzer divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, completed their refit near Dnepropetrovsk. Rail transports delivered rebuilt Panzer IVs with long-barreled 75 mm guns and a handful of new Tigers, concentrated into heavy companies for maximum shock effect. Replacement crews, many drawn from Hitlerjugend classes of 1925 and 1926, underwent accelerated gunnery courses by daylight and night march navigation drills after dusk. Waffen-SS commander Paul Hauser received direct orders from Mannstein: prepare to strike north in a converging pincer once Soviet spearheads overstretch themselves. Luftwaffe air recon confirmed Soviet fuel dumps clustered around Krasnograd and Krasnoarmysk, ideal targets for a sudden armored thrust. Concurrent political considerations shaped both sides' decision-making. In Berlin, Goebbels launched a propaganda campaign titled Shield of the East, depicting SS panzer units as the Reich's avenging sword that would soon restore order. Soviet newspapers proclaimed the imminent liberation of left bank Ukraine and urged collective farm committees to reconstitute local Soviets behind the advancing front. Yet detachments of NKVD troops struggled to re-establish civil authority amid smashed telephone lines, ruined bridges, and refugee streams fleeing both directions along potholed highways. Weather further complicated operations. A brief thaw on the 18th of February turned roads into slush, immobilizing Soviet supply trucks and forcing tank brigades to wait for hard frost overnight before resuming kilometer front without reserves, and were incapable of holding Kharkov against a concentrated Soviet assault. The Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions remained in staging areas farther west, still under orders not to engage until the situation clarified. Despite the chaos, the Soviet advance had begun to show signs of overextension. Roads were choked with traffic, fuel shortages mounted, and captured Wehrmacht supply depots were ill-suited to support mechanized units operating deep in enemy territory. Logistical frictions slowed progress. Soviet planners, focused on the rapid exploitation of momentum, had underestimated the sheer scale of infrastructure repair needed to sustain the offensive beyond the Donets. On the 15th of February, Red Army forces entered Kharkov's northeastern suburbs. The German garrison offered limited resistance before withdrawing westward under cover of darkness, demolishing bridges and fuel dumps in their wake. Soviet sappers moved in swiftly to secure crossings, while local communist partisans emerged from hiding to assist with route marking and prisoner handling. By the 16th of February, the hammer and sickle flag flew once more over the city. Soviet newspapers celebrated the third liberation of Kharkov with triumphant headlines. Stalin sent personal commendations to the front commanders, and plans began for pushing deeper toward the Dnieper. But within German high command, Mannstein had completed preparations for a counterstrike. His plan exploited the salient created by the Soviet push, an exposed narrow wedge of Red Army formations pushing far ahead of their flanks. He ordered General Hauser's SS Panzer Corps to redeploy southeast of Kharkov, ready to strike at the Soviet southern flank. Simultaneously, the XL Panzer Corps under General Henrici would move north to cut off the tip of the salient, creating a double envelopment. The maneuver depended on deception, speed, and terrain familiarity. Mannstein knew that even a brief delay in Soviet response could yield a decisive operational victory. On the 19th of February, orders were issued. Operation Donets was to begin. The opening moves took the Soviets by surprise. While they prepared for a German defense around the Dnieper, Mannstein's formations surged eastward. The Totenkopf division spearheaded the attack with grim efficiency, its armored columns tearing through lightly defended Soviet forward positions near Krasnograd. Red Army reconnaissance underestimated the scale of the German buildup and interpreted the attacks as localized spoiling operations. But as armored clashes intensified, it became clear that a larger counteroffensive was underway. By the 22nd of February, Soviet headquarters had registered the scale of the maneuver, but by then, the German pincer had begun to close. Villages and supply points behind the Soviet front erupted in flames as German units bypassed strong points and targeted command posts, radio stations, and fuel convoys. The SS Panzer divisions, better equipped and more mobile than the surrounding German infantry, carried much of the burden. Leibstandarte struck northward with precision, isolating Soviet armored elements near Lozovaya. Das Reich followed with brutal close-quarters engagements in the snow-covered woods, dislodging dug-in Soviet infantry with flamethrowers and assault guns. The Soviets, caught off balance and spread thin, began a chaotic withdrawal. Some units held out for days in encircled pockets, awaiting relief that never came. Others attempted to retreat across the Donets, where German artillery and Luftwaffe dive bombers decimated convoys and pontoons. The trap had closed, and Kharkov was once again in German sights. The counteroffensive reached its next stage as German armored columns began to pivot toward Kharkov from multiple vectors. Mannstein's operational concept, a flexible backhand blow, emphasized maneuver over static confrontation. This approach allowed mobile German units, particularly the SS Panzer Corps, to strike selectively at vulnerable Soviet formations, encircling and annihilating them piecemeal. Between 23 and the 26th of February, Totenkopf and Das Reich executed rapid thrusts across the southern approaches to Kharkov, effectively severing the lifelines of Soviet forces operating within the city and pushing defenders into a compressed pocket. The Soviets, initially confident that Kharkov had been secured, now faced a spiraling crisis as their lines buckled under coordinated German pressure. The geography of the region played to the German advantage. Rolling steppe terrain, dotted with patches of forest and crisscrossed by partially frozen rivers, enabled fast movement of mechanized formations while complicating the consolidation of Soviet defenses. Soviet units trapped in shallow defenses found themselves targeted by massed artillery strikes followed by armored assaults. Attempts to regroup were frustrated by Luftwaffe sorties that struck at command vehicles and transport hubs. Compounding these setbacks, Soviet supply chains had failed to keep pace with their own advance. Many forward units had only days of fuel and ammunition, and cold weather fatigue further reduced operational effectiveness. General Pavel Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army, one of the principal Soviet spearheads, was among the hardest hit. Deployed deep into enemy territory and unable to re-establish a coherent defensive perimeter, his armored brigades were forced to fall back under fire. Communications between forward elements and rear echelons broke down. Radio intercepts reveal urgent calls for reinforcement and resupply, many of which went unanswered. Soviet command now faced a difficult choice: reinforce the collapsing salient and risk further losses, or withdraw and abandon Kharkov for the 3rd time in the war. Stavka's response was a mix of hesitation and determination. Stalin, informed of the unfolding situation, was reluctant to authorize withdrawal, fearing the political cost of another major reversal so soon after Stalingrad. Front commanders attempted to regroup and hold Kharkov at all costs, pulling reserves from secondary sectors and forming improvised defensive belts within the city. Trenches were dug anew in frozen soil, minefields hastily laid, and barricades constructed in major avenues. Yet the Germans were already tightening the noose. On the 1st of March, Totenkopf launched a full assault from the west, engaging in fierce urban combat along Kharkov's outer districts. The city, already devastated by earlier occupations, became the site of yet another brutal struggle. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble under combined artillery and tank fire. House-to-house fighting ensued, with flamethrower units and demolition teams clearing out Soviet holdouts. Civilians who had welcomed Soviet troops just weeks earlier were again forced to flee or shelter in cellars amid shell fire. Leibstandarte, approaching from the north, struck the city's flanks, exploiting gaps created by the collapsing Soviet front. The pincer movement closed in with methodical precision. Soviet attempts to coordinate a breakout failed, as German armored thrusts sliced through retreating columns. The Luftwaffe maintained near-total air superiority, harassing every daylight movement. By the 7th of March, German units had entered the city center. Soviet resistance, though determined, began to fracture. Key commanders were killed or captured, and thousands of Red Army soldiers surrendered in disorganized groups. As German banners were once again raised over central Kharkov, Mannstein's counterstroke stood as a dramatic reversal of fortunes. In less than a month, he had transformed a collapsing southern front into a stunning operational success. Yet the cost was high. The city was in ruins, tens of thousands were dead or wounded, and the German army had expended a significant portion of its mobile reserves. While Hitler hailed the victory as proof of German resilience, Mannstein remained cautious. He understood that the Red Army was far from defeated, and that Kharkov would not remain quiet for long. With Kharkov retaken by mid-March 1943, German command sought to consolidate gains and re-establish a stable front along the Donets River. However, the success of Mannstein's counteroffensive came with pressing operational concerns. The SS Panzer divisions, despite their achievements, had suffered attritional losses in both men and materiel. Fuel stocks were low, armored vehicles required urgent maintenance, and infantry replacements lagged far behind battlefield demands. Nevertheless, Hitler, emboldened by the victory, interpreted the reversal as a sign that the Wehrmacht could once again seize the strategic initiative in the east. He demanded immediate preparation for a renewed offensive, one that would, in his words, cut out the Kursk salient like a cancer. But even before the Kursk operation began to take shape, the aftermath of the Third Battle of Kharkov continued to unfold. In the weeks that followed the city's recapture, German forces undertook extensive mop-up operations. Isolated Soviet pockets in the surrounding countryside were hunted down, often by ad hoc Kampfgruppen combining tanks, infantry, and mobile artillery. The region, pockmarked by trenches, shattered buildings, and frozen corpses, became a zone of grim reoccupation. Summary executions of captured partisans and suspected collaborators were carried out by both Wehrmacht and SS units. Propaganda photographers documented the liberation of Kharkov, but behind the images lay a city once again ravaged by war and stripped of its remaining infrastructure. Soviet reactions to the defeat were immediate and multifaceted. High Command conducted internal inquiries into the premature commitment of armored units and the failure to anticipate German maneuver warfare. The loss of Kharkov, following closely on the heels of the Stalingrad triumph, forced a reassessment of Red Army doctrine. Overreach, it was now acknowledged, had replaced sound operational judgment in the euphoria of winter success. Marshal Zhukov's personal diaries and subsequent reports admitted that the belief in an unstoppable Soviet advance had led to dangerous strategic complacency. Orders were issued to shorten supply lines, improve rear area security, and reduce reliance on poorly coordinated mobile offensives. For the Red Army soldiers who survived the encirclement and retreat, the experience left deep scars. Memoirs from infantrymen of the 40th and 69th Armies described desperate last stands, freezing night marches under fire, and entire companies being annihilated in minefields or airstrikes. Many wounded never reached medical care. Meanwhile, partisan groups in the Kharkov region faced renewed persecution as German forces reasserted control with brutal efficiency. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were razed and mass arrests resumed. The Soviet population, once again under occupation, faced harsh reprisals and collective punishments. The cycle of liberation and repression continued. German logistical planners, aware of the strain on supply lines following the rapid advance, began re-establishing rail connections and rebuilding depots in and around Kharkov. Engineers worked to restore transport hubs destroyed during the Soviet withdrawal. Armored trains brought fuel and ammunition from Dnipropetrovsk and Poltava, while horse-drawn convoys ferried supplies to frontline units still holding defensive lines east of the city. Repair workshops sprang up in former Soviet facilities, cannibalizing damaged tanks and trucks to maintain the depleted panzer forces. Still, these efforts could only partially offset the toll taken on the German war machine by months of high-tempo operations in winter conditions. Within the SS Panzer Corps, morale remained high, fueled by a sense of elite status and the recent victory. However, the price of the Kharkov operation had been steep. Totenkopf alone had lost hundreds of men in the final assaults, and even seasoned officers began to question how long such offensive tactics could be sustained without sufficient reserves. Discussions between General Paul Hauser and fellow corps commanders pointed to growing unease over the lack of strategic depth. If the Red Army struck again with sufficient force, there would be little left to halt them. Indeed, Soviet preparations for renewed offensives were already underway. Intelligence reports from German signals units intercepted increasing radio traffic across the Kursk-Orel-Belgorod axis. Soviet air reconnaissance patrols became more frequent. The front, while momentarily stabilized, crackled with anticipation. German planners, pressured by Berlin, now looked toward launching a preemptive strike. But while the Wehrmacht had demonstrated operational brilliance at Kharkov, its broader strategic situation remained perilous. Mannstein's victory had bought time, but not safety. The Eastern Front's next phase would demand even greater resources, and the enemy was learning fast. In the wake of the Kharkov counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht's temporary stabilization of the Southern Front masked the growing imbalance of resources between Germany and the Soviet Union. Though the German High Command could celebrate Mannstein's victory as a masterstroke of operational art, the Red Army retained the strategic initiative across much of the Eastern Front. Soviet industry relocated eastward beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe now produced tanks, artillery, and aircraft at a rate Germany could not match. And while elite German units had inflicted heavy losses, the Soviet command structure demonstrated increasing resilience, absorbing setbacks, reassigning leadership, and rapidly replenishing formations. Throughout April 1943, German field commanders focused on regrouping and fortifying positions around the salient created by the Soviet advance near Kursk. The salient, a massive bulge extending westward into German lines, presented both a threat and an opportunity. Hitler, under pressure to regain the strategic initiative before the Western Allies could open a second front, ordered preparations for Operation Citadel, a pincer assault designed to eliminate the salient and destroy Soviet forces in the region. The SS Panzer divisions that had fought in Kharkov were now pulled back into reserve for refitting and reorganization. Among them, Leibstandart, Das Reich, and Totenkopf received replacements, new equipment, and upgraded vehicles, including the latest Tiger I heavy tanks and Panthers. In parallel, the Soviets fortified the Kursk sector with unprecedented depth. Intelligence had confirmed German intentions, and Stalin made the rare decision to adopt a defensive posture. Entire armies were assigned to the salient's defense, constructing layered positions that extended dozens of kilometers in depth. Trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and fortified bunkers created what would become the most heavily defended line in the history of modern warfare. Soviet engineers laid hundreds of thousands of mines, while artillery units zeroed in on likely approach routes. Aircraft were repositioned for tactical support, and new tank formations trained for counteroffensive roles. Meanwhile, the Kharkov region settled into an uneasy occupation. German authorities reinstated strict administrative control, issuing ration cards, curfews, and loyalty oaths. Einsatzgruppen resumed operations targeting perceived dissidents, and the SS used the region as a testing ground for ideological warfare. Propaganda units flooded the city with posters decrying Bolshevism and promising stability under German rule. Yet resentment simmered beneath the surface. Soviet partisans continued to sabotage rail lines, ambush convoys, and pass intelligence to Red Army handlers. In response, German units implemented harsh countermeasures, burning villages, executing hostages, and deporting entire communities suspected of collaboration. The civilian cost was staggering. Local food production had collapsed under the weight of requisitions and battlefield damage. Typhus and dysentery outbreaks spread in overcrowded quarters, while hospitals, already emptied during the fighting, lacked supplies to treat the wounded or sick. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, and efforts to rebuild remained minimal. German priorities focused almost entirely on sustaining the front and preparing for the next offensive. Kharkov, once a jewel of Soviet industrialization, had become a shell of its former self, a city trapped between ideologies, armies, and survival. Within the Wehrmacht's officer corps, debates emerged over the long-term viability of the Eastern Campaign. Mannstein, although hailed as the architect of the Kharkov victory, expressed doubt about Operation Citadel's prospects. He argued that a defensive stance, exploiting the Red Army's tendency to overextend, might better preserve Germany's dwindling resources. His warnings, however, were overruled by Hitler, who insisted that another bold offensive was the only path to victory. The same elite SS formations that had achieved success in Kharkov would now be tasked with piercing the Soviet defenses at Kursk. Training intensified. Crews drilled with new tanks, practiced rapid assault maneuvers, and rehearsed breakthroughs under simulated fire. Despite heavy propaganda portraying the coming operation as decisive, Frontline officers were under no illusions. Reports from the front warned of massive Soviet fortifications, increasing numbers of T-34s, and unrelenting partisan activity. The glow of victory in Kharkov had begun to fade, replaced by the looming shadow of another, far larger confrontation. The Wehrmacht had proven it could still strike hard, but whether it could endure the coming storm remained uncertain. As summer approached, the momentum generated by the German victory at Kharkov gave way to a tense anticipation across the Eastern Front. While Berlin projected confidence in upcoming operations, seasoned commanders in the field recognized that the dynamic had shifted. The Red Army was no longer the poorly coordinated force of 1941. Its officer corps had gained experience, its doctrine was evolving, and it now fielded formations, capable of absorbing massive losses while maintaining offensive capabilities. Kharkov had been a tactical victory, but the larger strategic balance was beginning to tilt irreversibly in the Soviet Union's favor. In Kharkov itself, the German occupation regime faced increasing instability. The city's shattered infrastructure and exhausted population strained under occupation policies designed to extract maximum military value with minimal investment. German administrators requisitioned all functional industry for war production, conscripted local labor, and diverted food supplies to frontline formations. Civilian suffering intensified. Resistance activity, which had waned during the battle, resurged in its aftermath. Underground cells linked to Soviet intelligence coordinated sabotage efforts, passed battlefield information through couriers, and organized assassinations of collaborators and military personnel. The SS responded with sweeping arrests and mass executions in nearby villages. Public hangings were staged as warnings, but far from eliminating dissent, these actions hardened the resolve of many locals who had once remained passive observers. Meanwhile, preparations for Operation Citadel reached their final phase. The SS Panzer divisions refitted west of Belgorod and were reinforced with cutting-edge armor and new recruits, many of whom lacked combat experience. Totenkopf received additional Tiger tanks, while Das Reich and Leibstandarte integrated Panther units into their ranks. Machines that boasted formidable firepower but remained mechanically unreliable in field conditions. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, struggling with shortages of spare parts, fuel, and trained technicians. Supply lines stretched thin, relying on vulnerable railheads and overburdened truck convoys traversing exposed routes targeted by Soviet partisans. The soldiers who had fought through Kharkov were aware that the next battle would be unlike anything they had faced before. Reports from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations confirmed that the Soviets had constructed vast defensive systems in depth, with mutually supporting strongpoints, mine belts, and concealed anti-tank positions. Intelligence officers estimated that the Red Army had deployed over 1 million troops in the salient, supported by thousands of tanks and guns. Yet the German plan remained unchanged. 2 Panzers, launched from the north and south, would converge near Kursk to encircle and annihilate the defenders. The SS divisions, once again, were assigned a central role in the southern assault. As June passed, delays plagued the operation. Hitler, wary of committing armor prematurely, postponed the start date to await additional deliveries of Tigers and Panthers. This indecision, though meant to strengthen the offensive, gave the Soviets precious time to fortify. Soviet engineers accelerated mine-laying operations, while mobile anti-aircraft units shielded forward positions from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. By the time Operation Citadel was greenlit for early July, the element of surprise had all but evaporated. Within the ranks of the SS Panzer divisions, officers maintained discipline and morale through relentless training and ideological reinforcement. Political officers emphasized the stakes. Failure would mean the collapse of the Eastern Front, the loss of German dominance in Europe, and the return of Bolshevik control over Ukraine. Propaganda materials recycled imagery from Kharkov, soldiers raising banners over ruined Soviet positions, tanks rolling triumphantly through snowy streets, as a promise of what would come again. But behind the slogans lay the unspoken truth. Casualties from Kharkov had been severe, replacements were often inexperienced, and fuel shortages were already limiting training exercises. By the final week of June, the assembly of forces was complete. German units lined up in assault formation south of Kursk, with armored spearheads positioned for the breakthrough. The battlefield stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a mosaic of ridges, fields, forests, and fortified Soviet positions invisible to the eye but deadly in function. Totenkopf would spearhead the attack through the central sector, aiming to rupture the first line of defense before flanking elements could exploit the breach. The same armored columns that had struck like lightning at Kharkov now faced a test far greater in scale and intensity. Kharkov had proven that German armored warfare could still achieve local superiority, but Citadel would determine whether that advantage could translate into strategic victory, or whether Kharkov would stand not as a harbinger of resurgence, but as the last gasp of German offensive power on the Eastern Front. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began with a thunderous artillery barrage and concentrated Luftwaffe strikes across the Kursk salient. German panzers surged forward through pre-cleared lanes in the dense minefields that fronted Soviet positions. The SS Panzer Corps, positioned on the southern face of the salient, led the charge. Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandarte unleashed their armored columns into what quickly became the most fortified battlefield in history. Initial progress was promising. German tanks broke through the first Soviet defensive lines near Belgorod and Yakovlevo, smashing strong points with coordinated artillery and close air support. Infantry followed, clearing trenches with grenades and flamethrowers. Yet for every kilometer gained, the Germans paid dearly in blood and materiel. The Soviets, fully prepared for the offensive, responded with layered defense in depth. As German tanks advanced, they were channeled into kill zones by natural terrain and man-made obstacles. Anti-tank guns, concealed in tree lines and sunken positions, opened fire at close range. Soviet sappers detonated charges beneath bridges and culverts to collapse German advance routes. Minefields were far denser than expected, some zones containing more than 1,500 mines per kilometer. The losses mounted rapidly. Mechanical failures among new Panther tanks increased, with many vehicles breaking down before reaching enemy contact. Flames and smoke rose from the steppe as immobilized panzers burned under Soviet fire. Despite these obstacles, the SS divisions pressed forward with grim determination. Totenkopf led a major assault toward the Sel River, aiming to outflank the Second Soviet Defensive Belt. After a brutal engagement at Berezovka, the division crossed the river under fire and established a precarious bridgehead. Simultaneously, Das Reich fought a punishing battle at Belenikino, where Soviet Guards units mounted fierce counterattacks supported by Katyusha rocket barrages. Air superiority, once a German advantage, began to erode as Soviet fighter groups flew in overwhelming numbers. The skies above Kursk became a battleground of their own, and the Luftwaffe, stretched thin after years of attrition, could no longer guarantee control. By July 10th, German spearheads had pushed to within striking distance of Prokhorovka. Here, the SS Panzer Corps prepared for what was hoped to be a decisive breakthrough. Intelligence indicated that Soviet reserves were concentrating in the area, and German commanders believed they could preempt any counteroffensive with a swift assault. Yet the Red Army had anticipated this move. The Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army, under General Pavel Rotmistrov, had secretly maneuvered into position and now lay in wait. What followed on July 12th would become one of the largest and most chaotic armored clashes in history. At dawn, German and Soviet armor collided in the field south of Prokhorovka. The battle was unlike any that had come before. Visibility was poor due to smoke and dust. Engagements occurred at point-blank range. Dozens of tanks were destroyed in the first hour alone. Totenkopf's Tigers clashed with waves of T-34Es, many of which closed the distance to engage with ramming and short-range fire. Das Reich and Leibstandarte attempted to flank the Soviet formation, but terrain and defensive obstacles forced them into frontal assaults. By afternoon, the battlefield had become a graveyard of burning steel, shattered tracks, and smoldering corpses. Neither side achieved a clean breakthrough. Despite inflicting heavy losses, the Germans could not exploit any gaps. Soviet counterattacks were relentless, and the weight of numbers began to tell. Fuel shortages and ammunition depletion hampered continued German operations. Communications broke down as radio networks were overwhelmed, and commanders lost track of unit positions. As night fell, both armies pulled back slightly to regroup, but the initiative had slipped from German hands. The chance to split the Kursk salient had passed. Mannstein requested reinforcements and urged continuation of the offensive, arguing that the Soviet line was near collapse. But strategic priorities shifted. On July 13th, Hitler, concerned by the Allied invasion of Sicily, ordered the suspension of Citadel. Reserve divisions were to be redeployed to the Mediterranean. The SS Panzer Corps, bloodied and exhausted, received orders to withdraw. Their tactical performance had been exceptional, but operational goals remained unfulfilled. The legacy of Kharkov now stood in stark contrast to the outcome at Kursk. Where one had been a triumph of mobility and deception, the other became a grinding attritional struggle that Germany could no longer afford. The SS divisions had demonstrated their combat prowess, but even elite formations could not overcome the sheer scale and preparation of Soviet defenses. The Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one where the Red Army dictated the tempo and German forces fought increasingly on the defensive. In the aftermath of Prokhorovka, the SS Panzer Corps disengaged under mounting pressure and withdrew from the battlefield in stages, covered by rearguard actions and limited air support. The terrain they left behind, littered with the husks of destroyed vehicles and hastily buried dead, was a sobering testament to the scale of the confrontation. For German High Command, the failure to achieve a breakthrough at Kursk marked the collapse of the final major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The momentum, wrested back so dramatically at Kharkov just months earlier, had now slipped beyond recovery. As Operation Citadel was abandoned, Soviet forces launched immediate counteroffensives. The Red Army, which had conserved strength throughout the German attack, struck with fresh reserves across the northern and southern flanks of the salient. On the southern axis, the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, codenamed Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev, opened in early August. Its objectives were clear: recapture Kharkov, destroy the weakened German panzer groups, and drive toward the Dnieper. For the SS Panzer divisions, there would be no respite. Though under strength, low on fuel, and burdened with equipment losses, they were ordered to form the backbone of the German defense around the city they had just retaken. German commanders, including Mannstein, recognized the danger, but lacked sufficient reserves to reconstitute a stable front. Infantry divisions, depleted and under-equipped, manned hastily prepared positions along the southern approach to Kharkov. The SS divisions were rotated back toward the city, forming a mobile reserve to counter Soviet breakthroughs. Between August 10th and 15, Soviet forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming forward German outposts and forcing a general withdrawal toward the outskirts of Kharkov. Heavy rains and crumbling infrastructure slowed reinforcement efforts. The German logistical network, already strained from the demands of Citadel, now verged on collapse under the pressure of continuous retreat. By mid-August, the front lines once again reached Kharkov's suburbs. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army and 53rd Army initiated enveloping maneuvers from the north and east, while mobile infantry divisions pressed into the southern districts. SS units conducted counterattacks to delay the advance, often fighting block by block, street by street. But it was evident that the defenders lacked the strength to hold. Luftwaffe units attempted to stem the tide with precision strikes, but fuel shortages limited flight time, and Soviet anti-aircraft defenses had grown more sophisticated. Communications between sectors faltered. Orders to withdraw were issued, then countermanded, then reinstated. Confusion reigned. German civilians and military personnel began a second evacuation of Kharkov. Files, supplies, and equipment were burned or transported west by overburdened trains. Remaining Ukrainian collaborators, fearing Soviet reprisals, fled with retreating Wehrmacht units. German demolition squads mined key infrastructure, bridges, and industrial sites to deny their use to the enemy. Fires raged in the industrial zones, casting black smoke over the city as rear-guard formations prepared for a final stand. The echoes of the previous occupation still hung heavy. Repression, famine, and terror had scarred the civilian population. Now, the return of Soviet control brought both relief and fear. On August 23rd, after fierce engagements in the city's center and industrial quarter, Soviet forces declared Kharkov liberated. The third and final loss of the city for the Germans marked the symbolic and operational end of Mannstein's earlier triumph. The SS divisions, having fought doggedly to delay the Soviet advance, withdrew in battered columns toward Poltava and Krasnohrad, harassed by Soviet aircraft and partisans at every turn. Casualty rates were severe. Entire companies had been wiped out in the urban fighting, and many officers killed or wounded. The divisions that had once been the spearhead of German counterattack now resembled skeletal remnants of their former strength. Mannstein, deeply frustrated, argued that the loss of Kharkov could have been avoided if strategic priorities had not been diverted to the Mediterranean. His protestations fell on deaf ears in Berlin. Hitler blamed the withdrawal on insufficient will and ordered an investigation into command decisions, though no meaningful consequences followed. In truth, the loss stemmed not from tactical errors, but from a systemic inability to sustain the scale of warfare that the Eastern Front demanded. Germany could no longer match the Soviet Union in numbers, replacement rates, or depth of defense. The battlefield shifted westward once more. Soviet forces, now confident in both leadership and logistical capacity, pushed toward the Dnieper. Kharkov, for the fourth time in the war, was left in ruins, its population decimated, its economy crippled, and its strategic value reduced to symbolism. For the SS Panzer Corps, the Kharkov campaign would become a point of both pride and bitter reflection. Their greatest battlefield success had, within 6 months, turned to irrevocable retreat. The Eastern Front, once a theater of German initiative, had become a gauntlet of survival. As German forces retreated westward in the wake of Kharkov's final loss, the larger strategic picture became unmistakably grim. The Red Army, having reclaimed one of the war's most contested cities, now enjoyed uninterrupted momentum. Soviet armored spearheads pushed across the steppe, heading toward the Dnieper River and the industrial heartlands of eastern Ukraine. The Wehrmacht, worn down by years of attritional warfare, found itself increasingly incapable of mounting a coherent defense. Entire army groups fell back under relentless pressure, abandoning positions that had once formed the backbone of Germany's eastern ambitions. Within the SS Panzer Corps, the operational consequences of the Kharkov withdrawal were severe. The divisions that had taken part in the defense, Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandarte, were no longer the formidable strike formations they had been just months earlier. Losses sustained during Kursk and the Belgorod-Kharkov defensive battles had hollowed out their ranks. Tank strength was down by over half in some regiments. Replacement crews were rushed to the front with minimal training. Morale, while outwardly maintained through ideological reinforcement and command discipline, began to waver as the stark reality of the Eastern campaign set in. No amount of tactical prowess could reverse the strategic tide. The retreat itself became a slow, grinding battle of attrition. As the Wehrmacht moved toward the Dnieper, it executed a scorched earth policy, destroying infrastructure, crops, and factories to deny their use to the advancing Soviets. Bridges were rigged with explosives, dams sabotaged, and entire rail yards obliterated by demolition teams. Villages along the withdrawal routes were evacuated or razed, leaving behind skeletal ruins. The German retreat was methodical but merciless, designed to delay the Soviet advance at any cost, even civilian suffering. Despite these measures, Soviet logistics and engineering units restored crossings and rail links at a remarkable pace. The Red Army no longer stalled at broken bridges or flooded rivers. It adapted, rebuilt, and advanced. For the civilian population of eastern Ukraine, the changing lines of control brought little respite. After surviving multiple occupations, many towns were reduced to husks. Those suspected of collaboration with the Germans faced summary reprisals. Those who had resisted endured renewed interrogations and suspicion. The NKVD re-established authority with characteristic ruthlessness, arresting former local officials and suspected sympathizers. Food remained scarce. Disease spread in the wake of the fighting. Rebuilding efforts, where they existed, focused entirely on restoring military utility, rail lines, depots, and staging areas, leaving civilians to scavenge amidst ruins. As the German front neared the Dnieper, questions of operational doctrine and strategic direction came to the fore within the high command. Mannstein, ever the realist, proposed flexible defense strategies, elastic lines, counterblow tactics, and prioritization of supply corridors over symbolic strongpoints. He argued that clinging to cities like Kharkov had cost Germany irreplaceable assets. Yet his proposals were increasingly ignored in favor of Hitler's insistence on static, politically motivated defenses. Cities and river crossings were to be held to the last man, regardless of their actual military value. Orders from Berlin grew more disconnected from the realities on the ground. Meanwhile, the Red Army refined its own operational doctrine. Experience gained at Kharkov and Kursk informed new tactics, massed artillery coordination, deep penetration tank formations, and tightly integrated air-ground cooperation. The Stavka's planning apparatus grew in confidence and precision. With Kharkov secure, Soviet strategists began outlining successive operations aimed at recapturing the industrial Donbass, liberating the left bank Ukraine, and ultimately breaching the Dnieper line. The failure of Germany's summer campaign had not only ceded terrain, it had shattered the illusion that the Eastern Front could be stabilized. German intelligence assessments confirmed this shift. Reports from frontline units described increasingly aggressive and competent Soviet behavior. Night assaults, once rare, became routine. Soviet infantry employed storm groups with flamethrowers and satchel charges to eliminate bunkers and machine gun nests. Tank brigades now maneuvered in close coordination with self-propelled artillery and mobile engineer units. The days of isolated, reckless Soviet attacks had passed. In their place stood a modernized, increasingly professional army capable of sustained, multi-pronged offensives. As the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Dnieper, the memory of Kharkov hung heavy in the minds of German soldiers and commanders alike. What had once been seen as a restored bastion, a symbol of regained initiative, was now a ruined, blood-soaked echo of fleeting success. The Eastern Front had entered a new and darker chapter. The question was no longer whether Germany could win in the East, but how long it could delay defeat. Kharkov had offered one last glimpse of operational brilliance, only to be consumed in the broader collapse that followed. By the autumn of 1943, the German defeat at Kharkov and the subsequent Soviet offensives had redrawn the strategic map of the Eastern Front. The Dnieper, once envisioned as a potential final line of defense, was breached at multiple points. Key cities like Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk would soon fall. The dream of restoring German momentum after Stalingrad had died, not with a decisive blow, but through exhaustion, attrition, and the sheer weight of Soviet resurgence. In this transformation, Kharkov played a defining role, not merely as a contested city, but as the symbolic fulcrum where tactical brilliance collided with strategic reality. For the SS Panzer divisions, Kharkov had been both a peak and a prelude to decline. In February and March, they had executed a daring counteroffensive, restored German pride, and temporarily destabilized Soviet operations. Their performance was lauded in Berlin and broadcast across Europe as evidence of renewed German superiority. Propaganda turned Kharkov into a legend of resistance and vengeance, a battlefield where elite formations had reversed the tide. Yet this illusion unraveled swiftly. By August, the same divisions were retreating under fire, their numbers reduced, their equipment wrecked, their aura of invincibility shattered. The myth of Kharkov endured longer than its strategic gains. In military academies and post-war memoirs, Mannstein's backhand blow would be dissected as a masterpiece of operational art. But within the broader narrative of the Eastern Front, it stood as a warning that tactical success, no matter how skillful, cannot compensate for grand strategic failure. Germany's inability to replace lost divisions, maintain extended supply lines, or adapt to the industrial superiority of the Soviet Union doomed its efforts. The soldiers who had reclaimed Kharkov in March now found themselves fighting rearguard actions, facing a Red Army that had learned, adapted, and grown immeasurably stronger. On the Soviet side, Kharkov's final liberation solidified confidence in the long war. It demonstrated that even elite German formations could be broken even after achieving major victories. Soviet morale surged as the army crossed into territory that had been occupied for years. The liberation of Ukraine became not only a military campaign, but a national project of restoration, revenge, and identity. Every village retaken, every bridge rebuilt, reinforced the belief that the Red Army would reach Berlin, not if, but when. For the civilians of Kharkov, however, the end of the battle brought neither celebration nor peace. They returned to a city in ruins, its population decimated, its infrastructure obliterated. Starvation, disease, and the trauma of occupation haunted every street. The process of rebuilding would take years, and the scars, physical, political, and emotional, would never fully heal. Kharkov's people had endured 3 occupations, 2 major battles, and countless purges. They had been conscripts, victims, witnesses, and survivors. In the post-war years, Kharkov's story became part of the larger Soviet victory narrative. Monuments were erected, books written, medals awarded. Yet behind the official history remained the complexity of what the city had endured. The cycles of violence, the ideological warfare, the sacrifices imposed by distant capitals. For the Germans, Kharkov faded into the litany of Eastern disasters, its temporary recapture remembered more for what it failed to change than for what it achieved. Ultimately, the Battle of Kharkov was a pivot point, not because it altered the war's outcome, but because it illuminated the core contradictions of the German war effort in the East. It was a battle won by skill, but lost by strategy. It showcased courage, precision, and initiative, but in service of a cause that could not be sustained. And it marked the beginning of a steady retreat that would not end until the ruins of Berlin echoed with the thunder of Soviet guns.